then sue me after the funeral. That's what she told the billionaire's lawyer when they said she'd violated the contract. The one she signed at 3:17 in the morning 15 years ago. 7 figures to disappear while pregnant. To make her son fatherless on paper, so his life could stay clean. She did it, raised that boy alone. And now he was dying, 15 years old, maybe weeks left, and his last wish was to meet his father. Not for money, not for an apology, just to look into the eyes that matched his own and see if the man who paid to erase him would feel anything at all. What happened next would cost a billionaire everything, and give a dying boy the only answer that mattered. The billionaire stood in the rain at a funeral for a son whose name he'd never said out loud. James Edwards didn't belong here. Not in this small cemetery on the edge of town where headstones leaned like tired old men. Not among these 15 people gathered in a semicircle, their faces drawn and wet. Not holding an umbrella over Candy Hoffman, the woman he'd paid to vanish when she was 24, and pregnant and terrified. But he came anyway. The casket was simple. Pine, not mahogany, no gold handles, no excessive flowers trying to dress up death. Just a boy, 15 years old, named John. A boy James had met exactly 3 weeks before this moment. A boy who'd looked up at him from a hospital bed with James's own eyes and said 5 words that would hollow him out from the inside. Don't disappear again, even if it's hard. The rain came down steady, turning the grass to mud beneath their feet. Candy stood beside him, still as stone. Her coat, worn at the elbows, practical, the kind you buy to last, not to impress, hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight. James could see it in her wrists, in the way her collar gaped at her neck. Grief had carved her down to something sharp and unbreakable. She'd barely looked at him since he arrived. James shifted his weight, the umbrella handle slick in his palm. His shoes, Italian leather, custom made, worth more than most people's rent, sank into the soft earth. He'd dressed carefully that morning. Dark suit, no tie. He'd stood in his closet for 20 minutes, trying to decide what a man wears to his own son's funeral when no one knows the boy was his son at all. Except now they did. Now everyone knew. A woman stepped forward, Candy's sister, James guessed. Same narrow shoulders, same way of holding her chin when she was trying not to cry. She held a folded paper, the edges damp. She began to read, her voice shaking. John was the kind of person who noticed things, small things. If you forgot your lunch, he'd share his. If you seemed sad, he'd sit with you. He didn't ask questions. He just stayed. James felt something crack in his chest. There were others. A nurse from the hospital, Margie, he'd heard Candy call her, who spoke about John's quiet bravery. 2 teenage boys, awkward in 2 big suits, who talked about chess games and late-night texts about constellations. A coach who choked up halfway through and had to stop, just shaking his head, unable to finish. They painted a picture of a boy who loved astronomy, who hated tomatoes, who asked his mother if she'd eaten before he touched his own plate, who pretended not to notice when she cried at night, but left her notes in the morning. Little things. You're doing great, Mom. Don't forget to smile today. James hadn't known any of this. He'd had 3 weeks, 21 days. And in that time, he'd learned John took his coffee black, same as James. That he wanted to study engineering. That he had a scar on his left hand from trying to fix Candy's car when he was 13. That he'd laughed quiet, like he was afraid to take up too much space. But James hadn't known about the notes. The way John made people feel seen. The chess, the stars, the smallness of his kindness. And now he never would. The service ended. People began to move, quiet and slow, like waking from something they didn't want to leave. They filed past the casket, touching it briefly, fingertips to wood. Goodbye, pressed into pine. James stayed back, watched. Candy was last. She stood there longer than anyone else, her hand flat against the surface, her head bowed. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. When she finally stepped away, her face was blank. Not peaceful, not resolved, just empty. That's when she saw James check his watch. He didn't mean to. It was habit, muscle memory. But his wrist turned, his eyes flicked down, just for a second, and when he looked up, Candy was staring at him. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went cold. James opened his mouth, closed it. There were no words for this. For standing at your son's funeral and checking the time like you had somewhere better to be. He didn't. He had nowhere. His calendar was empty. His assistant had cleared the entire week. But 15 years of meetings and mergers and moments where time equaled money had trained his body to measure everything in minutes. Even this. Candy turned away. The crowd dispersed. Cars started. Headlights cut through the gray. Within 10 minutes, the cemetery was nearly empty. Just James. Just Candy. And Margie, the nurse, standing a respectful distance away, waiting. James took a step toward Candy. Stopped. What was he supposed to say? I'm sorry? He'd been saying that for 3 weeks, and it hadn't brought John back. Hadn't erased 15 years. Hadn't changed the fact that he'd paid 7 figures for Candy to disappear, and she had. And with her went a boy James never let himself imagine. Candy reached into her coat pocket, pulled out an envelope. For a moment she just held it, staring down at the paper like it weighed more than it should. Then she walked over, held it out. He wanted you to have this, she said. Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw. James took it, his hands were shaking. He noticed that and hated it. James Edwards didn't shake, didn't falter, didn't lose composure in negotiations or depositions or boardrooms full of men trying to smell weakness. But this wasn't a boardroom. He looked down at the envelope. His name, in handwriting he recognized from hospital charts, James Edwards. Careful letters, neat. The penmanship of a boy who'd been raised by a woman who believed details mattered. He wrote it a week before. Candy stopped, swallowed. A week before. James wanted to open it, wanted to tear it open right there and read whatever goodbye his son had left him. But he couldn't move, couldn't breathe past the tightness in his throat. Thank you, he managed. Candy nodded, started to walk away, stopped, turned back. You know what I can't figure out? She said, and her voice had something in it now. Not anger, not bitterness, something sharper and colder. You came. You actually came. Not just today. You came 3 weeks ago when I called. You sat with him. You talked to him. You showed up. She paused and James waited, knowing there was more. So where were you for the 15 years before that? The question sat between them like a body. James had an answer. He'd been building it for 3 weeks. It was polished, rational, about priorities and careers, and not being ready and believing it was better for everyone if he stayed away. He'd practiced it in mirrors, refined it, made it sound almost reasonable. But standing there, rain-soaked and hollow, he realized the truth was simpler and worse. He'd been a coward. I don't know, he said finally. Candy's jaw tightened. She looked at him, really looked at him, and James saw something in her face he hadn't expected. Pity. She pitied him. He forgave you, she said quietly. I don't know why, I don't know how, but he did. She turned and walked to where Margie waited. The 2 women got into a car, old, dented, the kind that starts on the 3rd try. James watched them drive away, watched the taillights disappear into the rain, and then he was alone. He looked down at the envelope in his hands. The paper was soft, worn at the edges, like John had folded and unfolded it, making sure the words were right. James slid it into his coat pocket. He couldn't read it. Not here, not now, not standing over the grave of a boy he'd helped create and then paid to forget. Stories like this, the ones about choices we can't undo, they matter. Because somewhere, someone is making the same mistake right now. Choosing what's easy over what's right. Choosing silence over showing up. And maybe they'll hear this. Maybe they'll do what James didn't. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever watched someone choose money over people, stay with me. There are women in this community who understand. We see you. James turned to leave. His shoes squelched in the mud. The rain was lighter now, but the sky was still heavy, still gray. He made it 3 steps before he stopped, because he had to know. He had to understand how they'd gotten here. To this cemetery, this rain, this unbearable ending that felt less like resolution and more like the beginning of something worse. And to understand that, you have to go back. To a transaction that happened in the dark. To the night James Edwards stood in a young woman's apartment at 4 a.m. with documents and money and the absolute certainty that he was solving a problem. To the moment he decided some lives were worth erasing. And Candy Hoffman, 24, pregnant, exhausted, trapped, decided surviving was worth more than pride. James Edwards wasn't always the man standing in that rain. Once he was younger, sharper, more certain. And the night he met Candy, he made a decision that seemed simple at the time. Pay her to leave. Make it clean. Move on. But 15 years later, standing over the grave of a boy named John, who had his eyes and his hands and a heart better than James would ever have, he finally understood. Some problems don't stay solved. They grow up. And when they're gone, they leave behind exactly what you deserve. Nothing but rain. And an envelope you're too afraid to open. The money arrived before the goodbye. 3:17 a.m., Candy's phone glowed in the dark like a bruise. She'd been awake anyway. Sleep had become impossible at 19 weeks. Her body didn't fit right anymore. Not in her bed, not in her skin, not in the life she'd been trying to build. She lay there in the dark of her studio apartment, one hand on her stomach, feeling the flutter of something that wasn't quite movement yet, but wasn't stillness either. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it, squinting against the light. Bank notification. She stared at the screen, blinked, read it again. 7 figures. No message, no note, no explanation. Just numbers that didn't make sense at 3 a.m. when the world was supposed to be sleeping. Her first thought was mistake. Had to be. Banks didn't transfer that kind of money in the middle of the night. Not to 24-year-old women who waited tables and lived in apartments where the heat only worked half the time. Her second thought was James. And then she knew. Her hands started shaking. She sat up too fast, head spinning, and the room tilted. The numbers on her phone seemed to pulse, growing larger, more impossible. This wasn't a gift. Gifts came with cards, with explanations, with something human attached to them. This was different. This was an ending packaged as a beginning. Candy stood, paced. 3 steps to the kitchenette, 3 steps back. The apartment was so small she could touch both walls if she stretched. She'd told herself it was cozy when she signed the lease. Told herself she'd make it work. That she and the baby would be fine here. That she didn't need space or help, or a man who looked at her stomach like it was evidence of a crime he hadn't meant to commit. But now, staring at those numbers, she felt the walls closing in. Her phone buzzed again. A text. Unknown number. I'm coming over. We need to talk. No signature. Didn't need one. Candy looked down at herself. Oversized t-shirt, no bra, bare feet, hair a mess. She thought about changing, about making herself presentable, then decided against it. If James Edwards was coming to her apartment at 3 in the morning to buy his way out of fatherhood, he could see exactly what he was paying to erase. She waited, made coffee she wouldn't drink, stood at the window watching the street below, empty. Just streetlights and shadows, and the distant sound of a car alarm somewhere blocks away. At 4:02 a.m., headlights cut through the dark. A town car, black, pristine. It looked obscene parked on her street, next to rusted sedans and cars with duct-taped bumpers. The driver stayed inside. The back door opened. James stepped out. Charcoal coat that probably cost more than her car. Hair perfect. Face composed. He looked exactly like he did in the business magazines Candy used to flip through at the grocery store, back when she'd thought men like him existed in a different world than hers. Turned out worlds collided easier than anyone wanted to admit. She buzzed him up, listened to his footsteps on the stairs, counted them. 12. The door to her apartment was already unlocked. She'd left it that way. Some petty part of her wanted him to have to open it himself, to cross the threshold of the mess he'd made. He knocked anyway. "It's open," she called. James entered, stopped just inside the door. His eyes moved across the space, taking in the cramped kitchenette, the futon that served as both couch and bed, the stack of textbooks on the floor next to medical terminology notes. Candy was in school, trying to become a nurse, trying to build something that mattered. She watched his face, watched him calculate and catalog, and ultimately dismiss her entire life in under 5 seconds. "You're not alone," he said. And for a second, Candy thought he meant the baby. Then she saw him glance toward the hallway. A woman stepped into view, tall, sharp suit, leather portfolio under her arm. She had the look of someone who'd been awake for hours, who maybe never slept, who ran on efficiency and espresso. "This is Kendra," James said, "my attorney." Not an attorney. His attorney, like she was an accessory, a tool he brought to fix things. Kendra nodded once. Professional, cool. She didn't look at Candy's stomach either. Nobody wanted to acknowledge the reason they were all standing in this apartment at 4 in the morning. "Did you receive the transfer?" James asked, straight to business. "I did," Candy said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Want to tell me what it's for?" James slid his hands into his coat pockets. I think you know." "Say it." "Candy, say it," she repeated, harder this time. James exhaled. "It's for you, to start over somewhere else, somewhere better, away from here, away from you." He didn't deny it. Kendra moved then, setting her portfolio on the small table by the window. She opened it with practiced precision, pulled out documents already prepared, already printed, already assuming Candy's answer. The papers were thick, official, the kind with clauses and subclauses and words designed to trap you in language you couldn't fight. "We've drafted an agreement," Kendra said, her voice crisp and clinical. "It's straightforward. You accept the financial settlement. In exchange, you agree to relocate. No contact with Mr. Edwards. No public statements. No paternity claims. The child's birth certificate will list father as unknown. The child. Not your son. Not the baby. Not even James's son. The child. Like an item on an invoice." Candy pressed a hand to her stomach. The flutter was there again, stronger now, or maybe she was just shaking. "And if I say no?" she asked. James finally looked at her then, really looked at her, and what Candy saw wasn't cruelty. It was worse. It was indifference, wrapped in calm certainty. "You won't," he said quietly, "because this is the safest option. For everyone." "You're asking me to vanish," Candy said. I'm giving you the freedom to start over, James corrected, like the words meant the same thing. Like money and freedom were interchangeable. Somewhere better. The refrigerator hummed in the corner, ancient, loud. Candy had gotten used to it, the way you get used to anything when you don't have a choice. But now, in the silence of James waiting for her to agree to erase herself, the sound felt deafening. You haven't asked about the baby, Candy said. Not once. Not what I'm having. Not if it's healthy. Nothing. James's jaw tightened, just slightly, but he didn't answer. I heard the heartbeat yesterday, Candy continued, at my appointment. It's strong, fast. The doctor said everything looks good. Still nothing. Don't you want to know? Her voice cracked. She hated that. Hated giving him the satisfaction of seeing her break. I think it's better if I don't, James said finally. And there it was. The truth he'd been dancing around. He didn't want to know because knowing made it real, made it a person instead of a problem, made it harder to walk away with a clear conscience and a signed contract. Kendra shifted her weight. Ms. Hoffman, I understand this is difficult, but Mr. Edwards is offering you an opportunity most people don't get. Financial security, a fresh start, no legal battles, no complications. Complications? That's what they were calling her baby. A complication. Candy walked to the table, looked down at the documents, pages and pages of legal text. She didn't have a lawyer, couldn't afford one, didn't have anyone to call at 4 a.m. to ask if this was legal, if this was right, if this was the kind of thing you could sign and then take back later when the weight of it crushed you. She picked up the pen Kendra had placed beside the papers. There's a clause on page 7, Kendra said, flipping to it. It outlines the non-disclosure agreement. You cannot discuss the terms of this settlement. You cannot publicly identify Mr. Edwards as the father. Violation results in immediate repayment of all funds, plus penalties. So I take the money and disappear, Candy said. And in exchange, he gets to pretend none of this happened. That's reductive, Kendra said, but accurate. Kendra didn't argue. Candy looked at James. He stood by the door, backlit by the hallway light, hands still in his pockets. Calm, composed, already halfway gone. Why did you come here? Candy asked him. You could have had her handle this. Why show up? For the first time, James hesitated. Because I owed you that much, he said. But not more. No, he admitted. Not more. At least he was honest. Candy signed the papers, page after page. Her hand moved on autopilot, pen scratching across lines, initializing margins, dating the bottom. She told herself she was doing this for the baby. For security. For a life that didn't involve working double shifts until she went into labor. For a chance at something better than this apartment with its humming refrigerator and walls that closed in. She told herself this was practical, smart, the right choice. But when she set the pen down and looked up at James, she knew. He wasn't giving her freedom. He was buying her silence. There was something else. Something in the way James looked at her in that moment. Not with relief, but with something heavier. Something unsaid. But Candy was too tired, too hollowed out, to ask. She just wanted him gone. Wanted both of them gone. Wanted to be alone with the choice she'd just made, and the life growing inside her that would never know the man who'd paid to forget it existed. Kendra gathered the documents, placed them back in her portfolio. You'll receive additional instructions via email. We recommend relocating within 30 days. There are resources in the settlement to assist with moving. Costs, Candy said nothing. James moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. I hope it works out for you, he said, and he sounded almost like he meant it. Then he left. Kendra followed. The door clicked shut. and Candy stood in her apartment at 4:47 a.m., 7 figures richer and completely alone. She told herself the money was worth it. For years, she believed that lie, until the day her son figured out the truth. And when he did, his reaction wasn't what she expected. But there was something Candy didn't know that night, something James never told her. And when she finally learned it, years later, it would change everything. By sunrise, Candy was gone. She packed what mattered, left what didn't. The landlord found the apartment empty 3 days later, rent paid through the end of the month, keys on the counter. And 9 months later, during a thunderstorm that shook the windows of County General Hospital, she gave birth. Alone. She named him John because it was simple. A name that wouldn't lead anyone back to James Edwards. Not James Jr. Not a name that carried weight or expectation or the ghost of a man who'd paid to forget he existed. Just John. Plain. Unassuming. A name that could belong to anyone. The thunderstorm hit at 2:14 a.m. Candy had been in labor for 6 hours at County General Hospital, gripping the rails of a bed in a room that smelled like bleach and fear. The contractions came in waves that made her vision white out at the edges. She'd gone to the classes, read the books, practiced the breathing. But nothing prepared you for the reality of your body splitting itself open to make room for another life. She was alone. No partner in the corner timing contractions. No mother holding her hand telling her she was doing great. No sister cracking jokes to distract her from the pain. Just Candy and the medical staff and the storm outside rattling the windows, like it was trying to get in. Lightning cracked. The lights flickered. "You're doing fine, sweetheart," a voice said. Warm, steady. Candy looked up through tears she didn't remember crying. A nurse stood beside her, older, with gray streaks in her dark hair, and eyes that had seen 1,000 births and knew exactly which lies to tell to keep women breathing. Her name tag said Margie. "I can't," Candy gasped between contractions. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Margie said, and she took Candy's hand in both of hers. "You're already doing it." Thunder rolled. The storm raged, and Candy pushed. At 3:47 a.m., John took his first breath. The sound cut through everything. The storm, the exhaustion, the fear Candy had been carrying for 9 months. A cry, high and sharp and furious at being pulled into a world he hadn't asked for. The doctor placed him on Candy's chest. Tiny. Slick. So impossibly small she was afraid to move, afraid she'd break him just by breathing wrong. She looked down at him, at his dark hair matted to his skull, at his fists, clenched tight like he was already ready to fight, at his eyes, not open yet, but she knew. Somehow she knew they'd be the same eyes that had looked at her in that apartment at 4 in the morning and said, "I think it's better if I don't know." Candy wept, not from joy, not from relief, from terror at how much she loved him already. Because this love, this immediate, all-consuming, world-tilting love, it wasn't what she'd expected. She'd thought she'd feel grateful, determined, ready. Instead, she felt terrified. Because loving something this much meant you could lose it. Meant it could be taken. Meant every day, for the rest of her life, she'd wake up afraid that something would happen to this tiny person who was half her and half a man who'd wanted neither of them. "What's his name?" Margie asked, smiling down at them both. "John," Candy whispered. "Hello, John," Margie said softly, touching one small fist. "Welcome." The storm passed. Morning came. And Candy left the hospital 3 days later with a baby who slept in a car seat she'd bought secondhand and instructions she prayed she'd remember. They moved to a different city, different state. Somewhere James Edwards' name didn't appear on buildings or in newspapers. Somewhere Candy could disappear the way she'd been paid to. She enrolled John in daycare when he turned 2, so she could finish nursing school. Worked night shifts at a clinic when he started kindergarten. Built a life that was small, but stable. The kind of life where you knew your neighbors and shopped at the same grocery store and counted pennies, but never went hungry. John grew. Quietly. He wasn't the loudest kid in class or the most outgoing. He played by himself mostly, building elaborate structures with blocks, drawing constellations he'd seen in library books, asking questions that made adults pause and recalibrate. By age 10, John noticed things adults missed. He noticed how his mother tensed when certain commercials came on television, how she'd go still, her whole body frozen, staring at the screen like she'd seen a ghost. John would watch her from the corner of his eye, pretending to focus on his homework, while tracking every micro-expression that crossed her face. It always happened when James Edwards appeared. John didn't know who the man was at first. Just some businessman talking about investments or launches or charitable foundations. But he noticed his mother couldn't look away. How she'd reach for the remote and turn off the sound but keep watching. How her hands shook just slightly when she folded laundry afterward, like she needed to do something with her fingers to keep them steady. He never asked. Not then. By 13, John had figured it out. It wasn't hard once he started looking. He'd Googled James Edwards one night when his mother was working late. Read articles, looked at photos. Found one where the angle was just right, the lighting caught something, and John saw it. They had the same eyes, the same long fingers, the same way of tilting their head when they were thinking. The same small scar above their left eyebrow. John's from falling off a bike, James's from who knows what. John closed the laptop, sat in the dark of their apartment, and processed the fact that his father was a billionaire who'd apparently decided being a father wasn't worth the inconvenience. He didn't tell his mother he knew. What would be the point? She'd built a life around the lie that his father couldn't stay. John understood now. Couldn't and wouldn't were different words, but the result was the same. By 15, he stopped asking questions, but he knew, and Candy knew he knew. She could see it in the way he looked at her sometimes, not with anger or resentment, but with something worse. Understanding. Like he'd figured out exactly how much she'd given up, and exactly how much his father hadn't. John was the kind of boy who asked if his mother had eaten before he touched his own plate. The kind who pretended not to notice when she cried in the kitchen at night but left her notes in the morning. "You're doing great, Mom. Don't forget to smile today." He wasn't trying to be good, he just loved her. And he knew, somehow, even as a child, that she'd sacrificed everything for him. He got a job at 16, bussing tables at a diner, 3 blocks from their apartment. Gave his mother half his paycheck without being asked. When she protested, he just shrugged and said, "We're a team, aren't we?" They were. For 15 years, Candy built a life. Small, but stable. She told herself it was enough. That John would never need to know his father. That some doors were better left closed. That quiet nature, the way John noticed everything but said nothing, it would become both his greatest strength and his most devastating weapon. Because when he finally spoke, it would be with words his mother couldn't refuse. And then the diagnosis came. It was a Tuesday. Candy sat in a beige office that smelled like disinfectant and false hope. The doctor, young, earnest, clearly uncomfortable, spoke carefully, as if words themselves might shatter. "The biopsy results came back," he said. "It's a rare form of sarcoma. Aggressive. We have options, but I need you to understand the timeline we're looking at." Candy heard herself ask questions, practical ones, about treatment, about odds, about whether they'd caught it early enough. The doctor's face gave her the answer before his words did. Months, he said quietly. Not years. The room tilted. Candy looked at John, 15 years old. Tall now, taller than her. When had that happened? Sitting in the chair beside her with his hands folded in his lap. Calm. Too calm. She waited for tears, for anger, for the explosion that should come when you're 15 and someone tells you your life has an expiration date. John didn't cry. He nodded, asked practical questions. The same questions Candy had asked, but steadier, like he'd already processed what she was still trying to comprehend. What's the treatment schedule? How long do I have before we have to decide? Can I still go to school? The doctor answered each one patiently, kindly, and Candy sat there watching her son handle his own death sentence with more grace than most adults could manage. When they stood to leave, John reached over and took her hand, squeezed it, like he was the one comforting her. They walked to the car in silence. Candy's hands shook so badly she couldn't get the key in the ignition. John took them from her gently, unlocked the door, helped her in, got in the passenger seat, and just sat there while she fell apart. She sobbed, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and primal, the kind that makes no sound, because there aren't sounds big enough to hold that much grief. John held her hand the whole time. When she finally stopped, when the tears dried into something hollow and exhausted, John spoke. I want to make a list, he said quietly. Candy looked at him. What? Of things I want to do. Before. He didn't say the rest. Didn't need to. Okay, she managed. That night, John sat at their small kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. Candy watched from the doorway, expecting pages. Bucket lists were supposed to be long, weren't they? Full of adventures and destinations and all the things you'd run out of time for. John wrote one thing. Then he closed the notebook, looked up at his mother. And in his eyes, those eyes that belonged to a man who'd walked away, Candy saw something that broke her all over again. Determination. Here's where it gets important. Because what John wrote on that list wasn't about him. It was never about him. It was about giving his mother something she'd spent 15 years protecting him from. The truth. That night, John wrote a list. It was short. One item. I want to meet my father. Candy stood in the doorway of the kitchen, dish towel twisted in her hands, staring at the notebook John had turned to face. Her. 5 words. Written in his careful handwriting, the kind teachers always complimented. The kind that came from a boy who believed details mattered because his mother had taught him they did. 5 words that might as well have been a detonation. No, Candy said, immediately, too quickly, too desperately. John looked up at her. His face was calm, not pleading, not angry, just waiting. John, no, that's not, we can't. Why not? His voice was steady, reasonable, the same tone he used when asking about homework or what was for dinner. Like he was asking for something simple, instead of the one thing she'd spent 15 years making sure he never wanted. Because, Candy's voice cracked. She set the dish towel down, gripped the doorframe. Because he's not in our lives. He never has been. And there are reasons for that. What reasons? Complicated ones. I'm dying, Mom, John said quietly. Not cruel, just factual. I don't think we have time for complicated. The words hit her like a fist to the sternum. Candy crossed to the table, sat down across from him. She'd known this conversation would come eventually, had rehearsed it in her head 1,000 times. What she'd say when John was old enough to ask the real questions. She'd imagined doing it when he was 18, 21, when he was grown enough to understand nuance, to process betrayal without it destroying him. She'd never imagined doing it now. Not like this. Not with a clock running out. Your father couldn't be part of your life, she started, using the script she'd perfected over 15 years. It wasn't about you. It was about circumstances and timing and... Mom. John's voice cut through the careful lies. You promised me no lies. This feels like one. Candy's throat closed. She'd made that promise when John was 10, after he'd caught her crying one night and asked why. She'd given him some vague answer about being tired, about adult stuff, about nothing he needed to worry about. And he'd looked at her with those two old eyes and said, just promise me you'll never lie to me about the important stuff. She'd promised. And now he was calling her on it. Candy took a breath, then another. Then she told him everything. About meeting James at a charity event where she'd been waitressing. About 3 months of dating a man who seemed kind and ambitious and interested in her thoughts, not just her body. About the night she told him she was pregnant and watched his face close like a door slamming shut. About the money that arrived at 3:17 a.m. About James showing up an hour later with an attorney and documents already prepared. About the contract that paid her 7 figures to disappear, to never contact him, to list the father as unknown on the birth certificate, to sign away any claim John might ever have to the man who'd helped create him. John listened without interruption, didn't ask questions, didn't react, just sat there absorbing the truth of how he'd come into the world, wanted by his mother, paid to disappear by his father. When Candy finished, silence filled the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's television murmured through thin walls. So he knows about me, John said finally. Yes. And he paid you to disappear. Yes. John nodded once. Processing, cataloging, reorganizing 15 years of assumptions into this new, harder truth. Candy waited for anger, for tears, for him to say something cruel about her taking the money, about choosing financial security over a father, about building their life on blood money from a man who'd wanted them erased. Instead, John looked up at her and said quietly, I still want to meet him. John, I'm not asking for a relationship. I'm not asking him to be my dad. He paused, choosing words carefully. I want to know what he looks like in person, what his voice sounds like, if he drinks his coffee the same way I do. John trailed off, then finished softer, if he feels anything at all when he looks at me. Candy felt something crack inside her chest, because that's what this was really about. Not revenge, not confrontation, just a dying boy's need to know if the man who'd paid to forget him would feel even a flicker of regret when faced with what he'd erased. He doesn't deserve to meet you, Candy said, and her voice came out hard and raw. Maybe not, John agreed, but I deserve to meet him, don't I? And what could she say to that? That he didn't? That dying at 15 meant he didn't get to have the answers other people took for granted? That protecting him from his father's indifference mattered more than letting him decide for himself what he needed? She couldn't. James Edwards had paid to erase a problem, but problems don't stay erased. They grow up, they get sick. And sometimes they ask for the one thing money can't buy back, time. If he says no, Candy said slowly, if he refuses to see you, I need you to understand that's not about you. That's about him, about his cowardice, not your worth. I know, John said. Do you? Because I need you to really know that, John. You are the best thing I've ever done. The best thing I'll ever do. And if that man can't see what he missed, what he threw away, then he's the one who lost, not you. John reached across the table, took her hand. I know, Mom. but she could see in his eyes that part of him didn't. Part of him still wondered what was wrong with him that his own father would pay to forget he existed. I know some of you watching this have been John or Candy. Or maybe you've been the person who walked away thinking it was simpler that way. These stories don't have easy answers, but they have truth. And if you're still here with me, thank you. Leave a comment, just one word, describing how this makes you feel. Sometimes naming it helps. That night, Candy lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the contract she'd signed 15 years ago, about the clause that prohibited contact, about the penalties if she violated the non-disclosure agreement. But John was dying. And what could James Edwards take from her that mattered more than giving her son this one thing he was asking for? Nothing. He could take the money back, could sue her for every penny, could destroy her financially, and it wouldn't matter. Because in a few months, maybe less, she'd lose the only thing that had ever mattered anyway. Candy had one job for 15 years: protect John from the man who didn't want him. Now John was asking her to do the opposite, and she was running out of time to say no. 3 days later, Candy made the call. She sat in her car in the clinic parking lot, phone in her shaking hands. She'd rehearsed what to say, practiced keeping her voice steady, reminded herself she was doing this for John, not for her, not for James, but for a 15-year-old boy who deserved to ask his own questions and get his own answers. She dialed. The phone rang once, twice. A crisp voice answered. Professional, cool. Edwards Industries. Candy's mouth went dry. For a second, she couldn't speak. Couldn't remember the script she'd practiced. Couldn't remember anything except standing in her apartment at 4 a.m, watching James walk away like she was a problem solved rather than a person. Hello? Edwards Industries. How may I direct your call? I need to speak to James Edwards, Candy said. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. Mr. Edwards doesn't take unsolicited calls. If you'd like to leave a message with his office, I can transfer. Tell him it's about his son. Silence on the other end. Then, I'm sorry, what? His son. Tell him Candy Hoffman is calling about his son. He'll know what it means. Another pause. Longer this time. Candy could hear the receptionist's uncertainty, the mental calculation of whether this was a legitimate call or some scam. Some woman trying to exploit a connection that didn't exist. Please hold, the receptionist said finally. Classical music filled the line. Vivaldi, bright and incongruous. Candy closed her eyes, counted breaths, tried not to think about the fact that she was violating a contract. Breaking silence, opening a door she'd been paid to keep closed. The music cut off. Ms. Hoffman. A different voice, female, familiar in a way that made Candy's stomach drop. Kendra. The attorney from that night. Still there, still cleaning up James Edwards' messes. I need to speak to James, Candy said. That's not possible. Whatever you think. My son is dying, Candy interrupted. Her voice didn't shake. Didn't plead, just stated fact. And his last wish is to meet his father. So you can either put James on the phone, or you can be the person who tells a dying 15-year-old that his father couldn't spare 5 minutes. Your choice. She heard Kendra's intake of breath, the pause that came from someone recalculating. Hold, please, Kendra said. More silence. Then a click, and a voice Candy hadn't heard in 15 years. This is James Edwards. James Edwards received the call in the middle of a board meeting. He was 3 slides into a presentation on Q4 projections when Ruth, his chief legal officer, leaned in close. Her perfume was expensive and subtle. Her voice was neither. It's her, Ruth whispered. James's hand froze on the remote. The slide behind him showed growth trajectories in clean, ascending lines. Numbers that made sense. Problems that had solutions. Her who? He asked, though he already knew. Already felt it. that cold drop in his stomach that came from the past, refusing to stay buried. Hoffman. Candy Hoffman. The room blurred at the edges. James hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 15 years, had trained himself not to think it, had filed it away in the locked compartments of his mind, labeled resolved, handled, done. Names had power, and if you didn't say them, didn't acknowledge them, they couldn't reach back across time and pull you under. Except now one had. "Tell her I'm unavailable," James said, turning back to the screen. His voice was steady, professional, the same voice he used to shut down hostile takeover attempts and aggressive negotiations. "She says it's about your son," Ruth said quietly. The remote slipped from James's fingers, clattered against the glass table. 40 executives looked up at once, sharks sensing blood in the water. "Gentlemen," James said, and his voice came out smoother than it had any right to. "Let's take 15. The room cleared in under 2 minutes. Ruth stayed, waited until the door clicked shut before handing him her phone. "Line 2. She's been transferred 3 times. She's not going away, James." James took the phone, stared at it like it was a weapon. Maybe it was. He stepped to the window, 40 stories up. The city sprawled beneath him, buildings and traffic, and lives being lived by people who didn't know his name, didn't care about his quarterly earnings, didn't know that somewhere down there was a woman he'd paid to forget him, and apparently she'd refused to stay forgotten. He pressed the button. "This is James Edwards." "My son is dying," Candy said. No greeting, no preamble, just 5 words that detonated in James's chest. "And his last wish is to meet you." James closed his eyes. The city disappeared. The office disappeared. 15 years collapsed into the space between one breath and the next, and he was standing in a cramped apartment at 4 in the morning, watching a 24-year-old woman sign documents that erased him from her life, from their life. "You broke the agreement," James said. It came out automatic. Lawyer trained. The first line of defense when someone violated a contract. "Then sue me," Candy replied, and her voice was steel wrapped in exhaustion. "After the funeral." The words hit him like a physical blow. Funeral. Dying. Son. James pressed his forehead against the glass. It was cold. He focused on that, the temperature, the solid reality of it, because everything else felt like it was sliding sideways. "How long does he have?" James asked. "Long enough to know whether his father will show up," Candy said. "Or not." The accusation in those 2 words, "or not," landed exactly where she'd aimed it. "What's wrong with him?" James heard himself ask. "Sarcoma. Rare. Aggressive. They caught it late." Candy's voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word, then steadied. "He has months. Maybe less. I'm sorry. I don't need your sympathy. I need your answer. Will you meet him or not?" James turned from the window, looked at Ruth, who was watching him with the careful expression of someone witnessing a controlled demolition. She'd been there that night 15 years ago, had drafted the contract, had stood in that hallway, holding documents while James solved a problem with money and legal language. Now that problem had a name, had a disease, had a wish. "I need to think," James said. "He doesn't have time for you to think," Candy shot back. "He has a few months if we're lucky, less if we're not. So you can think all you want, but while you're thinking, my son is dying. And every day you take to decide is one less day. He has to get an answer to the question that's been following him his whole life." "What question?" "Whether his father ever cared at all." The line went quiet. James could hear Candy breathing on the other end. Measured, controlled, the way you breathe when you're trying not to fall apart in public. "County General," Candy said finally. "Room 304. I'll be there tomorrow at 2. If you're coming, come. If you're not, don't call again." She hung up. James stood there holding a dead phone, staring at nothing. James Edwards was a man who solved problems. He had lawyers for scandals, PR teams for crises, accountants for mistakes. He had protocols for hostile investors, procedures for market crashes, contingencies for every variable. His team could model, but he had no protocol for this. For a son he'd paid to forget. For a death he couldn't negotiate away. Ruth cleared her throat. "What do you need?" "I don't know." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." Ruth moved to the bar cart in the corner, poured 2 fingers of scotch, handed it to James. He took it, but didn't drink. "Tell me you didn't know," Ruth said quietly. "I didn't." "James." He looked at her. Ruth had been with him for 20 years, had seen him build an empire from smart risks and calculated moves, had watched him marry and divorce twice, had witnessed the carefully controlled life he'd constructed where everything had its place and nothing surprised him. She knew when he was lying. "I knew," James admitted. "Not the details, not this. But I knew he existed." What Candy didn't know, what James had never told her, was that he'd checked on them. Once a year, from a distance. He had a private investigator on retainer. Discreet, professional. Someone who could find information without leaving fingerprints. James knew John's school. His grades, good, consistently good. Honor roll every semester. He knew John played chess, had joined the astronomy club, worked part-time at a diner. He knew Candy had finished nursing school, worked at a clinic, lived in a small apartment that she'd made into a home. James told himself it was due diligence, making sure the settlement money was being used appropriately, ensuring Candy hadn't violated the non-disclosure agreement, standard risk management. But late at night, when he was alone in his penthouse that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, when he couldn't sleep and the city lights kept him company, he called it what it was, the only thread connecting him to the life he'd erased. And now that thread was pulling tight. And James had to decide, show up and face 15 years of consequences, or disappear again, this time permanently. "If you don't go," Ruth said, "you'll regret it for the rest of your life. If I do go, I'll have to face what I did." "You should have faced that 15 years ago." She was right. James knew she was right, but knowing didn't make it easier. That night, James sat in his study with a glass of scotch he still hadn't touched. He pulled up the latest report from the investigator, 6 months old. There was a photo. John at 15. Tall, thin, dark hair, wearing a diner uniform, walking to work. The photo was taken from across the street, telephoto lens, grainy but clear enough. Clear enough to see James's own eyes looking back at him. He'd never allowed himself to study the photos before. Had glanced at them just long enough to confirm identity, then filed them away. But now, he looked, really looked, at the way John carried himself, shoulders back, head up, like someone who'd been taught that posture mattered. At the set of his jaw, at the long fingers that matched James's own. At the life that could have been different if James had been braver. 2 days later, James stood outside County General Hospital, room 304. He'd been standing there for 7 minutes. His hand hovered inches from the door. He'd raised it 3 times, lowered it 3 times. 7 minutes of paralysis while nurses passed and gave him odd looks, and the world kept spinning around his inability to knock. Inside that room was a boy with his eyes, a boy who was dying, a boy he'd spent 15 years pretending didn't exist. James thought about leaving, about turning around and walking away and letting the past stay buried where he'd paid to put it. He could send money for treatment, the best doctors, experimental therapies, whatever might help. He could solve this problem the way he solved all his problems. From a distance, with money, without ever having to look at what he'd done. But then he remembered Candy's voice on the phone. Whether his father ever cared at all. And James realized that 15 years ago, he'd made a choice that seemed rational at the time, seemed clean, seemed like the right move for everyone involved. He'd been wrong, and this was the bill coming due. James knocked. The hospital room was smaller than James imagined. No machines screaming, no chaos of beeping monitors or urgent voices, just the quiet hum of a life running out. An IV stand in the corner, a chair by the window, pale green walls that tried and failed to look cheerful, and in the bed, a boy. John looked up when James entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They had the same eyes. James had seen it in the photos, the grainy surveillance images his investigator sent once a year. But seeing it in person, seeing his own eyes looking back at him from a face 15 years younger, it hit differently, like looking into a mirror that showed not who you were, but who you could have been. John was thin, too thin, the kind of thin that came from a body consuming itself. His hospital gown hung loose on his frame, but his posture was straight, shoulders back, even propped against pillows. Even dying, he held himself like someone who'd been taught that how you carry yourself matters. "You're taller than I expected," John said. The words broke the silence like glass shattering. James laughed. It came out wrong, too sharp, too late, too much like the nervous sound of a man who'd forgotten how to be human. He caught himself, cleared his throat. "Sorry, James started, then stopped. What was he apologizing for? The laugh? The 15 years? Everything. John watched him with those familiar eyes, waiting, not judging, just observing the way Candy said he always did, noticing things adults missed. "I didn't know about you," James said, because he needed to say something that would let him breathe. John shook his head gently. "That's not true." The words landed harder than any accusation. No anger in them, no bitterness. Just the quiet correction of someone stating an obvious fact. The sky is blue. Water is wet. You knew about me and chose not to be here. James felt something crack in his chest. "You're right," he admitted. "I knew. I'm sorry." "Okay," John said simply. And somehow that was worse than if he'd yelled. Worse than if he'd demanded explanations or thrown James out. The easy acceptance of the apology, like it was expected. Like, of course, his father would lie, even now, even here. James moved to the chair by the window. Sat. His hands didn't know what to do. So he folded them in his lap the same way John's were folded on top of the blanket. They sat in silence for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. "Do you want to know about me?" John asked finally. "Or is this just obligation?" James looked up sharply. "It's not obligation." "What is it then?" Honest question. Deserved an honest answer. "I don't know," James said. "Fear, maybe. Regret. Curiosity about who you became, despite me not being there." John considered this. Nodded. "Mom says you're a CEO, that you build things." "I do? Did you inherit that? Do you like building things?" "I like fixing things," John said. "Cars, mostly. Electronics. Things that are broken and need someone to figure out why." He paused. "I wanted to study engineering, mechanical engineering." Wanted. Past tense. Because wanting required a future. "That's good," James said. "Important field." "Yeah." Another silence. But this one felt less hostile. More like two strangers learning how to talk to each other without the weight of 15 years pressing down on every word. "Coffee," James said suddenly. "Do you drink coffee?" John's face flickered with something that might have been amusement. "Yeah, black, no sugar." "Same," James said. then softer. Same. They talked for hours, not about the big things, not about the money or the contract or why James had chosen his career over fatherhood. They talked about small things, safe things. Music. John liked classic rock, same as James. Books. John had just finished a biography of Feynman, the physicist. James had read it years ago. The part about the lock picking, John said, eyes bright. Did you love that? I tried it once, James admitted. Bought a practice lock. Took me 3 months to crack it. No way. Really? Really, I'm persistent. Me too, John said. And then quieter. Mom says I get that from her. The not giving up thing. James swallowed hard. She's probably right. The afternoon light came through the window at an angle, turning the room gold. John's hands, thin, too thin, folded on top of the blanket. The same long fingers James saw every time he buttoned a shirt. The same hands, 15 years apart. James learned that John loved astronomy, that he'd mapped constellations in a notebook he kept by his bed, that he hated tomatoes, the texture, but liked tomato soup, that he had a scar on his left hand from trying to fix Candy's car when he was 13, that he laughed quietly, like he was afraid to take up too much space. And with every detail, James felt the weight of what he'd missed. First steps, first words. The first time John read a full sentence or solved a math problem or asked why the sky was blue. Birthday candles blown out. Report cards brought home with pride. The chess trophy John won at 12. The astronomy presentation he gave in 8th grade. The moment he learned to drive. 15 years of moments James had paid to avoid. All of them gone. Irretrievable. Disappeared into the past he couldn't buy back no matter how many zeros he added to a check. You know what's heartbreaking about this? It didn't have to be a hospital room. It could have been a kitchen table, a baseball game, a graduation. But some of us, and I'm talking to those of us who've lived long enough to know, we learn too late that presence matters more than protection. If you understand that, if you've learned it the hard way like these two, share this story. Someone in your life needs to hear it before it's too late. The conversation eventually slowed, not from awkwardness but from exhaustion, John's body giving out even as his mind stayed sharp. I should let you rest, James said, standing. Remember when I said John's quiet nature would become his weapon? This was the moment. Because when James stood to leave, John reached out and caught his sleeve. Don't disappear again, John said, even if it's hard. 5 simple words that would haunt James Edwards for the rest of his life. James nodded, throat tight, unable to speak. Because they both knew what John was really saying. You left once. Don't make my death the second time. I won't, James managed finally. I promise. John released his sleeve, settled back against the pillows. Okay, good. James made it to the hallway before he had to stop, press his forehead against the wall, try to remember how to breathe around the fist, squeezing his chest. Candy was there, sitting in a chair by the nurse's station. She'd been there the whole time, waiting, watching through the window. Thank you, James said. Candy didn't respond, just looked at him with those exhausted eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. Can I come back? James asked. That's up to him, Candy said. Not me, not anymore. James came back the next day, and the day after that. For 3 weeks, he showed up. Sometimes they talked about physics and philosophy and whether the universe was infinite or just really, really big. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, just sat, father and son, watching afternoon light turn the room gold, existing in the same space, making up for lost time by simply being present. James learned to read when John was having a bad day, when the pain was worse and conversation was too much effort. On those days, James would just sit by the window and work on his laptop while John dozed. And sometimes John would wake up and seem surprised James was still there, like he'd expected him to disappear. The moment things got uncomfortable. But James stayed. He canceled meetings, delegated projects, let his assistant field the increasingly frantic calls from the office about decisions that needed making and opportunities that couldn't wait. Everything could wait. This couldn't. On good days, they played chess. John won every time. James suspected he was being gentle about it, that John could have demolished him in 5 moves, but stretched the games out to make them last longer. Neither of them mentioned it. On the best days, John would tell stories. About growing up with Candy. About learning to cook because his mom worked nights. About the time he tried to fix the neighbor's lawnmower and accidentally started a small fire. About his friend Marcus, who played terrible guitar, but James would probably like him anyway. James memorized every story, hoarded them like treasure, because these weren't moments he'd lived, weren't memories he'd made. They were glimpses into the life he'd chosen not to have, and he was grateful for every single one, even as they broke him. 15 years too late. On Thursday morning, the light came through the window, the same gold way it always did. James had brought coffee, 2 cups, black, no sugar. John was asleep when James arrived, so he'd set them on the table and settled into the chair to wait. He waited for 20 minutes before he realized John's breathing had changed. Slower, shallower. James stood, moved to the bedside, took John's hand, those long fingers that matched his own. "John?" No response. "John, I'm here. I'm right here." John's eyes didn't open, but his fingers tightened, just slightly, around James's, and then they didn't. John closed his eyes and didn't open them again. We're back where we started. The rain, the funeral, the billionaire holding an umbrella over the woman he paid to disappear. But now you understand what this funeral cost. Now you know that the boy in that casket, 15 years old, gone too soon, spent 3 weeks teaching his father how to be human. Now you know that James Edwards didn't just lose a son. He lost the chance to have been a father when it would have mattered. When there was still time to be more than a guest appearance in a dying boy's final chapter. The rain came down steady, turning everything gray and blurred. James stood beside Candy, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, but maintaining that careful distance of 2 people bound by shared loss, but separated by everything else. No cameras, no assistants, no armor. Just James in a dark suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, standing in mud that ruined his Italian leather shoes, holding an umbrella over a woman who'd survived 15 years without him, and would survive whatever came next the same way. The mourners gathered in a small semicircle around the casket, maybe 15 people total. A woman who looked like Candy but older, her sister probably, with the same narrow shoulders and the same way of holding grief like something heavy she'd been carrying for years. Nurse Margie from the hospital, the one who'd held Candy's hand during John's birth, now holding tissues and quietly weeping. 2 teenage boys in suits that didn't quite fit, awkward and devastated. John's friends. Marcus, probably, the one who played terrible guitar. They stood together, one of them gripping a folded piece of paper like it was the only thing keeping him upright. A man in his 50s with kind eyes and weathered hands. The chess coach John had mentioned. He'd brought a chess piece, a knight, and placed it on top of the casket like an offering. Small circle, real love. The contrast was devastating. James Edwards commanded boardrooms full of hundreds. Had shareholders and employees and people whose livelihoods depended on his decisions. Could fill an auditorium with people who knew his name, knew his reputation, knew the empire he'd built. But here, at his son's funeral, he stood silent at the edge, not quite part of the circle, not quite excluded, just present in the way a stranger might be, someone who'd earned the right to witness, but not to grieve like he'd been there all along. Candy's sister spoke first. Her voice shook, but held. John was the kind of person who made you feel seen. Not just noticed, seen. Like you mattered. Like your thoughts and your feelings and your fears all had weight. And he did it without trying, without making a show of it. He just cared, deeply, about everyone. She paused, wiping her eyes. He called me Aunt Sarah. Even though I told him he could just call me Sarah. He said everyone deserved their title, their respect. She laughed wetly. That was John, 15 years old, and already more grown up than most of us will ever be. Marcus spoke next, unfolded the paper with shaking hands. John wrote this 2 weeks ago. He said if anything happened, I should read it. So here it is. He cleared his throat. If you're hearing this, I'm probably gone. Don't be sad. Or do be sad, but don't stay that way. Life's too short to waste on grief that doesn't move. I got 15 years. Not enough. But I didn't waste them. I loved people. I learned things. I tried to make my mom's life easier, even though she probably didn't need my help. I saw stars. I fixed stuff. I laughed with my friends. And right at the end, I met my dad. So I got everything I needed, just not as long as I wanted. Marcus's voice broke. He couldn't finish. The other boy, tall, red-eyed, took the paper and read the rest. Tell my mom I love her. Tell Marcus his guitar playing will get better if he practices. Tell Coach Stevens the Sicilian defense was always my favorite. And tell my dad. Tell him it was enough. The 3 weeks. It was enough. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight, had presence, the kind you felt in your bones. James couldn't breathe. It was enough. 3 weeks, 21 days, and John, dying, 15 years old, with every right to be angry, had called it enough. The service ended. People moved toward the casket, touching it briefly, saying private goodbyes. James watched them file past, watched them grieve someone they'd known and loved, someone they'd been present for. He had no right to touch that casket, no right to claim grief he hadn't earned. But Candy saw him standing there, frozen, and something in her face shifted. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just a kind of terrible understanding. After everyone else had gone, she walked over to where James stood, reached into her coat pocket, pulled out an envelope. He wanted you to have this, she said, her voice scraped raw. James took it. His hands were shaking again. He looked down at the envelope. His name in John's careful handwriting. The same handwriting from hospital charts John had signed. The same neat letters that spoke to a boy who believed details mattered. He wrote it a week before he died, Candy said quietly. James couldn't open it. Not yet. Not here with Candy watching and the rain falling and his son's casket 10 feet away. Read it, Candy said. Not a request, a command. James's fingers fumbled with the envelope, pulled out a single sheet of paper, unfolded it. Dear James, I don't know what kind of man you were before you met me, but you were good with me. That matters. I'm not angry. I thought I would be. Thought meeting you would make everything worse. That I'd see what I missed, and it would hurt more than not knowing. But it didn't. You showed up. You stayed. You drank terrible coffee with me and let me beat you at chess, even though I know you let me win at least twice. Please, take care of my mom. She's stronger than you think, but she shouldn't have to be. She's spent 15 years being strong enough for both of us. She deserves someone to be strong for her for once. I don't know if you believe in second chances or redemption or any of that, but I think you got something these past 3 weeks. I hope it was worth showing up for. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. John James read it twice, then a third time. And when he finally looked up, Candy was watching him. Not with anger, not with forgiveness, just exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who'd carried 15 years alone, who'd loved a boy big enough for 2 parents, who'd watched that boy die, asking for the one thing she couldn't give him, a father who stayed. And here's what makes this moment devastating. James Edwards finally felt it. The full weight of what he'd bought. He'd paid for Candy to disappear, for John to not exist, for his life to stay clean and uncomplicated. And what did he get? 3 weeks. 3 weeks with a dying boy who showed him what kind of man he could have been if he'd been brave enough 15 years earlier. James wept in front of her, not quiet tears, not dignified grief. He broke, right there in the rain, in the mud, in the cemetery where his son was being laid to rest. James Edwards, CEO, billionaire, man who solved problems with money and control, fell apart. Candy watched, didn't move to comfort him, didn't tell him it was okay, or that he'd done enough. Just witnessed his breaking the way she'd witnessed everything else, with the quiet endurance of someone who'd survived worse. When James finally stopped, when the tears dried into something hollow, Candy spoke. "He forgave you," she said quietly. "I don't know why. I don't know how, but he did." "I don't deserve it," James said. "No," Candy agreed. "You don't. But he gave it to you anyway. That's who he was. Some of you have lived this. Maybe not this exact story, but the shape of it. The person who left. The child who suffered. The years you can't get back. You're not alone in this. The women who watch these stories, who leave comments, who come back week after week. We're a community of survivors. We're still here, still standing. And if you want to be reminded that you're not the only one carrying these stories, hit that subscribe button. Not for me, for you. So you remember you're not alone. Candy turned to leave. Margie was waiting by the car, patient and steady. "Candy," James called. She stopped, didn't turn around. "I meant what I said to John. I won't disappear again." Now she did turn, looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Don't make promises to me," she said. "Make them to yourself, and then keep them." She walked away. James stood alone in the rain, holding a letter from his dead son, surrounded by the consequences of choices he couldn't undo. John's wish to meet his father had been granted. But was it enough? For John, apparently yes. For James, it would have to be, because it was all he'd get. After the funeral, James did something no one expected, especially not himself. 3 days after John's funeral, James Edwards called an emergency board meeting. What he said next shocked everyone in that room. The boardroom was on the 42nd floor, all glass and steel, and calculated power. 40 executives sat around a table that cost more than most people's annual salary. They'd been summoned with 2 hours' notice. No agenda, no warning, just a terse message from James's assistant. Mandatory attendance, no exceptions. Ruth sat to James's right, her face carefully neutral. She knew what was coming, had tried to talk him out of it 3 times in the past 72 hours, had finally given up last when she realized James wasn't asking for permission or advice. He was informing her of a decision already made. In the back of the room, almost hidden among junior executives and department heads, sat Kendra. The attorney, who'd stood in a hallway 15 years ago, holding documents that erased a woman and a child from James's life. She'd been with the company for 20 years, had enabled more than one uncomfortable exit, had told herself it was just business, always just business. James stood. The room quieted instantly. "I'm shutting down the Livingston merger," he said. Silence. The kind that felt like a vacuum. Like all the air had been sucked out of the room, and everyone was waiting for it to return so they could breathe again. "I'm sorry, what?" someone finally said. "Mark, probably. Head of acquisitions. The man who'd spent 18 months negotiating the deal." "The Livingston merger," James repeated calmly. "I'm terminating negotiations. Effective immediately." "That merger would triple our company value," Mark said, standing now, his face reddening. "Triple it. We're talking billions in valuation." "I'm aware." "Then why?" "Because we're reallocating those resources," James said. His voice was steady, firm. The same voice he'd used to close deals and fire executives and navigate hostile takeovers. But now, he was using it to dismantle everything he'd built. "We're going to fund pediatric oncology research, specifically rare cancers that pharmaceutical companies won't touch because the patient populations are too small to be profitable." More silence. Confused faces. Someone whispered to someone else. "The foundation will be named after someone important," James continued. "My son, John Hoffman." The room erupted. Questions flew from every direction. "You have a son? Why haven't we heard about this? What the hell is happening? This is insane. The shareholders will—" James raised a hand. The room quieted again, but barely. The shock was giving way to anger, to panic about stock prices, and investor confidence, and quarterly projections. "I'm calling a press conference," James said. "This afternoon. I'll explain everything then. This meeting is adjourned." He walked out. Ruth followed, catching up with him in the hallway. "James, you know what this means. The board won't support this. You'll lose everything," James finished. "I know. I'm counting on it." The press conference was held at 3 p.m. in the building's main atrium. Reporters packed the space. Business, journalists, financial analysts, bloggers, anyone who'd gotten wind that James Edwards was making an announcement that would move markets. Cameras lined the back. Microphones clustered on the podium like metal flowers. James stood behind that podium in the same suit he'd worn to his son's funeral. He'd done this before. Faced cameras, controlled narratives, spun crises into opportunities. He was good at it. Had built a reputation on being unflappable. Not today. Today, he was going to tell the truth. And let it cost whatever it cost. "I made a choice 15 years ago," James began, and his voice carried across the silent room. "To prioritize my career over my responsibility as a father. I paid someone to disappear so my life could stay simple. That decision cost me everything that mattered." The cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. Her name was Candy Hoffman. She was 24, pregnant, and I gave her 7 figures to relocate and never contact me again, to list the father as unknown on the birth certificate, to pretend we'd never met. Someone gasped. Pens scratched on paper. Phones lit up as people texted their newsrooms. James continued, "She did what I paid her to do. She disappeared, and she raised our son alone. His name was John. He was quiet, brilliant, kind, everything I'm not. And 3 months ago, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer." His voice cracked, just slightly, but he pushed through. "His dying wish was to meet me. So Candy called, and for the first time in 15 years, I showed up. I spent 3 weeks with my son, learning who he was, realizing what I'd missed. And then he died." The room was silent now. Not the silence of shock, but of people witnessing something raw and uncomfortable, and impossible to look away from. "I can't fix the past," James said. "I can't bring him back. I can't undo the 15 years of his life where I chose not to be there. But I can make sure other families don't face what mine did. So I'm shutting down the Livingston merger and using those resources to fund pediatric oncology research. The John Hoffman Foundation will focus on rare cancers, the ones that kill children, while drug companies calculate whether they're worth investing in." He paused, reached into his jacket pocket. "There's one more thing." James pulled out a document, old, folded, the paper soft from 15 years of storage in a lawyer's file cabinet. "This is the non-disclosure agreement Candy Hoffman signed at 3:17 a.m. in an apartment that smelled like fear. It paid her to disappear, to stay silent, to protect my reputation at the cost of hers." He held it up so the cameras could see it. "And on live television, I'm tearing it up." He did, slowly, deliberately. The sound of paper ripping carried through the microphones. "Candy Hoffman owes me nothing. She never did. If she wants to speak about what happened, about who I was 15 years ago, and who I still am now, she's free to, because some debts can't be paid back, only forward." He stepped away from the podium. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras followed him. But James kept walking, out of the atrium, into the elevator, up to his office where he closed the door, and finally, let himself feel the weight of what he'd just done. In the back of the press conference, Kendra had watched everything. She'd enabled it, had stood in that hallway 15 years ago with documents already prepared, had typed the agreement that paid a pregnant woman to vanish, had told herself it was just business, just another contract, just another problem solved. Now she was watching her boss, the man she'd worked for 20 years, dismantle his own reputation to honor a son she'd helped him erase. That night, Kendra wrote her resignation letter. She didn't owe James Edwards anything, had already given him 2 decades of loyalty, of enablement, of looking the other way. But she owed herself more than this. She left the company the next week. The aftermath was brutal and swift. James Edwards lost investors, lost board members. 3 of the largest shareholders dumped their positions within 48 hours. His company stock dropped 23% in a week. Business publications ran headlines like "Career Suicide" and "Edwards' Empire Crumbles," and "Billionaire's confession costs billions." Financial analysts called it the most catastrophic self-inflicted corporate wound in recent memory. Said James had destroyed shareholder value to fund a vanity project. Said he'd lost his mind, his edge, his ability to separate personal from professional. And you know what James did? Nothing. He didn't fight it, didn't defend himself, didn't hire PR firms to spin the narrative or lawyers to threaten publications. He just let it happen, watched his empire crack, and didn't lift a finger to stop it. Because for the first time in his life, he understood that some things cost more than money, and some debts can't be paid back, only forward. The John Hoffman Foundation launched 6 weeks after the press conference. Initial funding, $2.3 billion. Money that would have gone to the Livingston merger, to increasing James's net worth, to building an empire that would outlive him. Instead, it went to research, to clinical trials, to families sitting in hospital rooms, watching their children die from cancers with names too long to pronounce and survival rates too low to hope. It wouldn't save John. Nothing could do that. But it might save someone else's son, someone else's daughter, and maybe, just maybe, some other father wouldn't have to learn this lesson the way James had. Too late. With regret, that had weight. In the quiet of consequences, he'd finally stopped running from. But there was still one person James hadn't faced. The one who'd survived it all. Who'd carried 15 years alone. who'd loved a boy big enough for two parents and buried him with a grace James would never possess. 3 weeks after the press conference, she agreed to meet him. They met on a bench in Riverside Park, the same park where Candy used to take John when he was small. The playground was still there, updated since then, new equipment in bright primary colors. But the bench was the same. Weathered wood, faded green paint, a small plaque someone had mounted years ago, in memory of those we carry. No lawyers, no cameras, just two people who'd survived the same tragedy from different sides. James arrived first, sat with his hands folded, watching children chase each other across the grass. Their laughter carried on the afternoon breeze, high and careless, and unaware that someday they'd learn grief had weight. Candy appeared at 2 p.m. exactly. Punctual, the way she'd always been. She wore jeans and a cardigan, sensible shoes, hair pulled back. She looked tired. But then she'd looked tired for 15 years. That's what carrying a child alone did. Wore you down to your foundation and made you rebuild yourself from whatever remained. She sat on the opposite end of the bench, left 3 feet of space between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I don't need your money," Candy said finally. "I know," James replied. "That's why I'm asking something harder." She looked at him then, waiting. "I want permission," James said carefully. "Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just presence. To be allowed to remember John, to visit his grave, to exist in the orbit of the life I tried to erase." Candy studied him. Her face gave nothing away. "Why should I let you?" "Because he asked me not to disappear," James said. "And I promised him I wouldn't. And keeping that promise means staying connected to the only person who knew him longer than 3 weeks. You want me to help you grieve a son you barely knew?" "Yes," James admitted. "I know I have no right to ask, but I'm asking anyway." Candy was quiet for a long time, watching the children play, watching the world continue spinning despite the fact that her world had stopped the moment John closed his eyes. "Tell me about the 3 weeks," she said finally. So James did. They talked for an hour. About John. About the 3 weeks James had with him. About the chess games, where John won every time, but made it look competitive. About the astronomy. How John had explained Hawking radiation and made it sound simple. About the way John laughed. Quiet, like he was afraid to take up too much space. "He did that his whole life," Candy said, smiling sadly. "Tried to make himself smaller, so I'd have more room. He told me you were the strongest person he knew. He was wrong. He was." "Maybe you both were," James said. Candy cried then. Not the quiet tears she'd shed at the funeral, but something deeper. 15 years of holding it together, of being strong enough for two, of surviving when survival felt like punishment. James didn't cry. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he didn't believe he'd earned the right. When Candy's tears slowed, she wiped her face with her sleeve, took a shaky breath. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. James waited. "John knew he was dying when he asked to meet you," Candy said. "The doctors told him first, before they told me. They wanted to prepare him, give him time to process. And he could have asked for anything. A trip, a wish, whatever kids with dying wishes get." She paused, looking at James directly now. "He asked for you, not because he thought you'd save him, but because he wanted to save you. From being the kind of man who could walk away and never look back. That's who my son was. He was 15 years old and dying, and he used his last wish to try to make you better." The words hit James like a physical blow. All this time, He'd thought John wanted to meet him out of curiosity, out of a dying boy's need for answers. But John had known, had seen James from a distance, through news articles and television appearances, and decided his father needed saving more than he needed knowing. James wept then, finally, because he understood. John's last gift wasn't forgiveness. It was a mirror, a chance to see himself clearly, to choose differently, to become the kind of man who showed up, not because it was convenient, but because it was right. John had given him 3 weeks to learn that lesson. And then he died, believing James would keep learning it. "I don't deserve that," James said when he could speak again. "No," Candy agreed, "but he gave it to you anyway." They sat in silence after that. Not uncomfortable. Just two people carrying impossible weight, sitting close enough to acknowledge it, but far enough apart to carry it themselves. Some stories end with weddings. This one ended with a bench in a quiet park. Candy sat beside James as they watched children play. Neither spoke. The past couldn't be fixed. John was still gone. 15 years were still lost. But the future, what remained of it, didn't have to be empty. "The foundation," Candy said eventually. "The John Hoffman Foundation. It's real?" "It's real. $2.3 billion committed. First grants go out next month." "He would have liked that, the helping part." "I know. But he would have preferred you'd been there from the beginning." "I know that, too." Candy nodded. "I'll allow it. The grave visits, the remembering. But on one condition. Anything. Don't make him a story you tell to feel better about yourself. Don't turn him into your redemption arc. He was a real person who lived and died, and deserved better than what either of us gave him." James flinched at the either of us. Candy including herself in the blame, when she'd been the one who showed up every single day. "I won't," he promised. "I'll just tell the truth." "Good." James Edwards learned what his son had given him. Not redemption. Truth. And the cost of learning it too late. Time passed. James visits John's grave every Thursday. The day John died. He brings updates. About the foundation, about the first clinical trial that showed promise. About the kids whose treatment is funded by the merger he killed. About the lives saved by the life he lost. He doesn't know if John can hear him. Doesn't particularly care. The visits aren't for John. They're for James. A weekly reminder of what presence costs and what absence cost more. Candy goes on Tuesdays. She brings flowers, daisies, John's favorite, though she never told James that. She talks to him too. About the foundation, about the women at work who remind her of him, about how hard it is to live in an apartment that feels too big now. They don't coordinate, but sometimes their flowers overlap, and that's enough. John's story doesn't end with his death. It continues every time someone hears it and makes a different choice. Every time a parent shows up instead of sending money. Every time someone chooses presence over convenience. That's legacy. That's what we do here. We tell the stories that need telling for the people who need to hear them. If you want to be part of that, if you want to honor not just John's story, but your own, stay with this community. Click that like button, not for the algorithm, but because these stories deserve to be found by the people who need them. Comment and tell me, what would you have done in Candy's place? In James's? Sometimes the most powerful thing we do is simply witness each other's truths. Thank you for witnessing this one. 6 months after John's death, Candy received a letter from a mother in Oregon whose daughter had the same rare sarcoma, who'd gotten into a clinical trial funded by the John Hoffman Foundation, who wanted Candy to know that her son's name was saving lives. Candy read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the box, where she kept John's things. His astronomy notebook, his chess trophy, the notes he'd left her on difficult mornings, and a letter from his father explaining why he'd stayed away. She didn't forgive James, probably never would. But she understood something John had understood. People were complicated, capable of both terrible choices and tremendous growth. And sometimes the cruelest thing was watching someone become the person they should have been all along. Too late to matter, just in time to hurt. The bench is still there, in Riverside Park. And on quiet afternoons, if you pass by, you might see two people sitting. Not together, but not alone. Carrying what can't be fixed. Living with what remains. Because some endings aren't happy. They're just true. And sometimes, that's the only kind of ending that matters.